When most people think of Jamaica, the images that probably come to mind are beaches, reggae, and maybe Bob Marley. But for most of the 20th century, Jamaica's real importance came from one resource: aluminum. Jamaica sits on one of the largest deposits of bauxite, that's the ore you refine into aluminum, in the world. For decades, this little Caribbean island supplied the metal that built everything from jets to beer cans to cars. This made Jamaica, a country of 2 million people, surprisingly important. When you're sitting on so much of an important resource, the politics of it all tend to matter to a lot of people for a lot of reasons. Jamaica gained independence from Britain in 1962. On paper, it looked like a colonial transition success story. The country had respected courts, an effective civil service, and a functioning competitive two-party democracy. British politicians considered it a Britain in miniature due to its perceived successes in adopting British political systems and culture. While Jamaica got a new flag and was now theoretically free to chart its own course, on the ground, things hadn't really changed much. The country had two main industries: bauxite extraction and tourism. Both of these were primarily owned by foreign companies, however. The bulk of the profits flowed out of the country, just as it did under British rule, and the average Jamaican saw little benefit. 6 of the biggest aluminum companies in the world operated here: Alcoa, Alcan, Reynolds, Kaiser, Anaconda, and Revere all had major holdings in Jamaica. Likewise, almost all the hotels in the country were owned by international corporations, like Sheraton, Wyndham, and Hilton. One of the foremost political issues in the new Jamaican state was who this country was serving. Aside from a handful of upper-class Jamaicans, most people had seen little change. Some of the most consistent and prominent critics came from the Rastafarian community. Rastafarians believed that black Jamaicans were being oppressed by the modern Western political order in the same way they'd been oppressed for centuries by slavery and colonialism. Formal independence, in their view, hadn't changed anything, as the people were still being exploited by the Western economic order, what they referred to as Babylon. The Jamaican government's response to this discontent, at first, was to simply ignore it, but it was only getting more organized, vocal, and taking on an international nature. Walter Rodney was a historian of Guyanese descent who also gave lectures at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica's capital, Kingston. He taught African history on campus, but was also known for traveling into Kingston's slums and giving talks to raise political awareness. He briefly left the country to attend a Black Writers' Conference in Montreal and was barred from re-entering Jamaica upon his return in October 1968. This was justified in Parliament by Prime Minister Hugh Shearer as protecting the country from his racialist views that could lead to violence and scare off foreign investment. This was under the leadership of the Jamaica Labour Party, one half of the country's two-party system. Founded in the 1940s, the party quickly became the dominant political force in the country. It lacked much of a formal ideology, however, instead focused primarily around the charismatic influence of its founder and longtime leader Alexander Bustamante. As he eventually stepped back from politics, however, the party did develop a platform, a very friendly attitude towards business and foreign investment. The JLP had faced little serious opposition for most of its existence, but banning Walter Rodney had led to nationwide protests and riots. The riots made it clear that the political consensus in the country had fractured. The government hadn't delivered serious change for most Jamaicans, and their response to anyone who said so was to throw them out of the country. There was a vocal demand for something different in Jamaican politics, and this would come in the form of Michael Manley. On paper, Manley was probably one of the last people you would expect to lead a populist movement for economic equality. He was born in 1924 into one of Jamaica's most prominent families. His father, Norman Manley, had founded the People's National Party, the other half of Jamaica's two-party system. Michael Manley got his education in Britain and probably had more in common with the Jamaican elite than any other group. While he initially wanted to be an art historian of all things, living in London inspired him to take up the anti-colonial fight. What truly changed him, however, was 2 decades of union organizing. Through the 1950s and 60s, he worked in a variety of industries across the island's sugar fields, bauxite mines, and factories. He represented workers against employers and corporations that still largely held colonial-era mindsets and operating procedures. He quickly became influential among the working class, often leading union rallies and helping them organize themselves into real political forces. Manley was elected to Parliament in 1967 and took over leadership of the PNP from his father in 1969 after narrowly winning a party election. This officially made him the leader of the opposition and allowed him to outline his platform at a national level. He was criticized initially by a leftist newspaper called Abeng, which stated that a new front of irrelevance was approaching for the party. Their prediction was incredibly incorrect. Manley would greatly reshape the party and Jamaican politics entirely. He emphasized a politics of participation, that citizens needed to be involved with politics beyond just voting. The slogan was 2 million prime ministers, as he encouraged things like workplace democracy and creating community councils to handle local politics. A question he tackled directly was that of national identity. Most politicians had awkwardly avoided the issue by calling Jamaica a Creole nation, which isn't exactly accurate. Manley, however, actively encouraged the population of the country to learn about their African roots. He said that Jamaican students should know as much about the Ashanti Wars as the War of the Roses. He didn't shy away from embracing the Rastafarian movement either. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, the central messianic figure in Rastafarianism, had visited Jamaica in 1966. While there, he gifted Manley a wooden walking stick, the Rod of Correction as it was called. Manley would frequently brandish it at rallies, using it as a tool to frame his movement not just as political, but also of a spiritual and moral nature. Bold things like this are what characterized his 1972 campaign for Prime Minister. His de facto slogans were "Beat Down Babylon" and "Sweep Them Out," which caused much consternation among the broader Jamaican establishment. Manley's redefining of Jamaican politics appealed to many who had been disillusioned by the stagnation of the JLP. Regarding the economy, his plan was pretty straightforward, to make the country's resources work for the people as much as possible. The bauxite underground and the beaches on the coast, the profits from them had always gone to British and now American and Canadian corporations. To be clear, he wasn't advocating for socialism or a command economy though. His first book, Politics of Change, didn't mention socialism once. Manley's model was closer to a Scandinavian model than anything, the state guiding the economy towards certain social goals, with workers having a strong voice. The threat posed by Manley wasn't his ideology, but instead what this implied practically. The existing arrangement, where Alcoa, Alcan, Kaiser could do whatever they wanted in Jamaica and send the profits north, would be completely upended. Manley also wasn't advocating for some grand revolution, only that the existing political mechanisms of Jamaica should be used differently. The label that would follow him throughout his political career was communist, a specter haunting him he could never quite shake off. It was applied to him by the Jamaican business establishment, foreign corporations, and eventually the US State Department. It was simply easier to attack him like this than go after the relatively tame arguments he was actually making. Manley's message of change and reform won his party a decisive victory in the 1972 elections, taking 37 of the Parliament's 53 seats. It would be the first transfer of power since the country's independence. Despite Manley's sometimes intense rhetoric, the transition was perfectly peaceful and smooth. He made a few symbolic but important changes immediately upon taking office. The national holiday on May 23rd, the colonial-era holiday of Empire Day, was abolished. In its place was the new Jamaican Labor Day, a day of voluntary work. Manley himself publicly participated in farm work on its first occasion. In an effort to distance the country from colonial customs, the Kariba suit was adopted by Manley and his cabinet. This was a deliberately understated and simple outfit, a contrast to more formal colonial styles. The suit was a relatively small thing, but it was representative of Manley's larger project to build a new national identity. While Manley wanted economic reform, he believed it would be difficult unless Jamaicans could believe in themselves, their culture, and their country. An initiative in this direction was the National Youth Service. Every Jamaican high school graduate was required to spend 2 years in public service before moving on to universities or their careers. Graduates were sent everywhere, from schools, farms, and even radio stations. The idea was to encourage mixing, to make these high school graduates come into contact with people and situations they may never have otherwise. It wasn't a very radical policy. It was emblematic of how Manley viewed democracy. It was something that required active participation, not just a visit to the ballot box every few years. In 1974, Manley's first real major policy arrived. Jamaica would be unilaterally imposing a massive production levy on all multinational aluminum companies operating on the island. Before, the Jamaican government received approximately $2 per ton of bauxite extracted. Overnight, that jumped to over $14, an over 600% increase. The previous tax had been negotiated when Jamaica was still a British colony. Manley both wanted a source of funding for his social programs and to show that an independent Jamaica would be standing up for itself. It worked, at least in the short term. Revenues surged, and this was a big win domestically. Manley followed this up by founding the International Bauxite Association, a collective of bauxite-producing nations. Modeled on OPEC, it was meant to give smaller nations coordinated leverage on the international market. Across the developing world, this got some serious attention. Here was a post-colonial nation that seemed to really have pulled it off. In Washington, this whole situation read very differently. Practically, aluminum was now going to be considerably more expensive, but it was also a country just 90 miles from Cuba that was taking an increasingly antagonistic stance towards the United States. Manley wasn't helping matters. He was a vocal supporter of anti-colonial movements in places like Mozambique, Angola, South Africa, many of which were communist or had links to communist parties. It also didn't help that he was indeed getting closer with Fidel Castro and openly modeling many of his social programs off of Cuban ones. In December 1974, feeling confident, Manley also officially committed his party to democratic socialism as an ideology. The increased bauxite tax and this new ideology is when Manley finally crossed the line and became a problem in the eyes of America. In practice, democratic socialism in Jamaica was far less extreme than the rhetoric suggested. The ambition was genuine, but Jamaica's institutions proved less adaptable than originally predicted. His attempt to establish workers' cooperatives in the sugar industry failed, for example. Sugar estates were handed over to their workers, Manley's idea of democracy directly applied to a major industry. It faced issues almost immediately, however. Union leaders were unhappy that their authority was being undermined by the government. Furthermore, most of the workers weren't familiar with the managerial side of things. The estates quickly became unproductive and uneconomic, leading to the whole experiment quickly and quietly being cancelled. The employee stock ownership plan was another experiment in this same vein. The idea was straightforward: create tax incentives encouraging private companies to give their workers equity stakes in the business. The plan never really got off the ground, though. Employers had little reason to dilute their ownership of their companies, and employees had little interest in taking on the risk of owning equity. The program again fizzled out without any real impact. The gap between Manley's ambitions and what could be practically achieved was a theme throughout his political career. The deeper crisis that the country would face came from beyond the country's shores, however. In 1973, OPEC's oil embargo sent energy prices skyrocketing across the world. For Jamaica, which imports nearly all of its fuel, this was pretty catastrophic. The country's foreign exchange reserves evaporated, inflation rose sharply, and suddenly Manley's social program seemed very, very expensive. The oil shock would send Jamaica into an economic decline it struggled to recover from. Manley won re-election in 1976 anyway, taking 47 of 60 seats, but the economic situation of the country was only getting worse. Shortages of basic goods became common, and many people and companies started moving money out of the country. By 1977, the foreign exchange situation had become dire enough that the government was forced to seek aid from the IMF. The conditions for receiving aid included various austerity measures, such as cutting agricultural aid and an end to food subsidies. The major programs Manley wanted to fund with the bauxite levy had to be severely curtailed. Domestically, the IMF bailout was referred to with the ridiculing acronym, "It's Manley's fault." Washington's opposition to Manley's government increased as well, capitalizing on the growing crisis. Significant funding was given to opposition media. The CIA was actively probing for political and economic weaknesses in the country to exploit. Capital flight accelerated as the business community grew more and more nervous. Political violence increased with this instability. In Kingston, so-called garrison communities sprung up, residential areas that were split along political lines. This phenomenon escalated into essentially war between people on the streets. The opposition was now led by Edward Seaga, who had taken over the JLP in 1974, the same year Manley had declared democratic socialism as his ideology. Seaga was a similarly driven and intelligent man, but with a completely opposite view on what policies the country should follow. Seaga believed Manley's experiments had failed, and that opening the country up to foreign investment would be the best option. Violence between the two parties' supporters continued to escalate through the 70s. In an attempt to broker a truce between the two sides, Bob Marley organized the One Love Peace concert in Kingston. Both Manley and Seaga were brought on stage and raised their hands together. While the crowd loved it and it was very good optics for both of them, it changed very little. The weapons fueling the violence came from what was called the guns for ganja trade. The American demand for marijuana led to gangs in the two countries swapping weapons for drugs, flooding Kingston with guns. By 1980, over 800 people had been killed in political violence across the country. Facing an economy in ruins and gun battles in the streets, Manley called an early election in 1980. His party only won 9 out of 60 seats. It was an absolutely disastrous result, and Seaga, now the Prime Minister, had a good explanation. Manley had misread Jamaica. Seaga's argument was that Manley hadn't lifted anyone up, just dragged the whole country down. He spooked foreign investors and domestic businesses alike, resulting in shortages and the need for an IMF bailout. Political violence had become rampant, and the economy was in a terrible state. Seaga wasted little time in dismantling what Manley had built. Things like community councils were scrapped, and worker participation programs were gradually wound down. Jamaica was firmly realigned with Washington. Seaga was among the first foreign leaders to visit Ronald Reagan after his inauguration in 1981. Controversially, Seaga called a snap election in 1983. The two parties had previously agreed that no election would be held until a new voter registration list had been completed, but Seaga had just broken that agreement. Manley and the PNP boycotted the election entirely, withdrawing their candidates. Seaga's JLP won all 60 seats in Parliament, and turnout for the election was absolutely abysmal at just 3%. It was technically legal to call this election, but it greatly undermined trust in the electoral system. At best, Seaga's leadership achieved mixed results. Foreign investment returned to some degree, and the relationship with the US was fixed, but economic growth was slow and uneven. By the late 1980s, the turnaround that Seaga promised hadn't materialized, and the country actually voted Manley back into office in 1989. Manley's third and final term was a departure from his previous more radical stance. Manley governed as pretty much a pragmatic centrist, and largely embraced the free market and its mechanisms. Even the Kariba suit was gone. He returned to office wearing typical Western business attire. In his first year back, he privatized 12 state-owned businesses, including 7 hotels. The guy who had promised to make the country's resources work for the people was now selling them back to the market. He didn't renounce his goals. He still talked a lot about inequality and economic justice, but he also said his previous approaches had been failures. He focused less on workplace democracy and more on increasing worker productivity. Terms set by the IMF, which he had previously called infringements upon Jamaica's national sovereignty, were now agreed to without complaint. The relationship with Cuba, something that had cost him dearly in the 1970s, was also quietly dropped. He let the Jamaican dollar float freely, removing the restrictions that had kept it artificially stable. The exchange rate immediately collapsed, leading to a balance of payments crisis the country never really recovered from. Socialism was simply not an option for a heavily indebted Caribbean nation in 1989. Manley stepped down in 1992 due to poor health and died in 1997. Ultimately, Michael Manley left behind a very mixed legacy. Almost none of his grand structural reforms survived, the worker cooperatives or democratized schools. These were dismantled pretty quickly and without much public protest, which tells you something about how effective they had been. A lot of Manley's less glamorous but probably more impactful social legislation did survive, however. Things like minimum wage increases and the Status of Children Act, which equalized the rights of children born outside of marriage. Maternity leave and free secondary education also stuck around. These aren't the kinds of things that make it into speeches, but they probably improved the lives of more Jamaicans than anything else Manley did. As for the bauxite, Jamaica has become sadly irrelevant in the global aluminum market, and bauxite production dropped off sharply past the late 1970s. Most of the aluminum companies had left by the early 2000s, finding cheaper bauxite elsewhere. The multinationals had options, and chose to exercise those options when Jamaica became less accommodating. It probably isn't an overstatement to say Manley's most lasting influence on Jamaica was the creation of the modern Jamaican identity. Jamaica today is a far different place than it was in 1962, with its own culture and confidence in its own identity. Causation is always hard to place with something as abstract and as fluid as culture, but the direction Jamaica has moved in is largely the same as what Manley was pushing for. Jamaica, also, is still a democracy. That may sound like a low bar, but really it isn't when you look at a lot of post-colonial nations where peaceful transfers of power are rare. Jamaica has done it throughout its turbulent history, without interruption. How much credit Manley deserves for that, whether it would have happened without him, is of course hard to say, but the institutions he built are still standing, and that's not nothing.
I'm sorry, the number you have reached is not in service. Please check the directory listing for the correct number. This is a recording from Kingston, Jamaica.